Today, and for the rest of this course, we'll see how anthropological perspectives contribute ideas and insight on some of the biggest challenges facing humankind. From war and conflict to medicine, criminal justice, and health, anthropology has exciting contributions to share. And today, we're going to think about violence and conflict resolution. These are crucial themes for anthropologists, you see, because the United Nations and the U.S. military and intelligence agencies, they all agree. Our increasingly dynamic climate, along with growing populations, well, they're going to lead to increased conflict throughout the world. And in our modern age, war and violence, they kind of appear as an unavoidable aspect of the human experience. In fact, over the past 5,000 to 6,000 years or so, we've seen over 14,000 major wars, and millions of lives have been lost in these conflicts. But as an anthropologist, I know that these grim statistics, they're not the whole story. Because in addition to uncovering the roots of war, anthropology has important lessons to bring to the table when it comes to providing cross-cultural insight on conflict resolution. So today, we're going to see how anthropology can be a peacemaker, or at least a conflict manager. But first, let's return to the history of human violence to clear up 3 big myths about humans and their proclivity towards violence and war. Anthropology, with its 4-field approach, can clear up 3 major myths about humanity and our so-called violent nature. 1, there has always been warfare. 2, we are biologically predisposed to violence. And 3, warfare is universal. Let's think about each one of those myths. First, have humans always been at war? Or is this form of organized violence more of a recent phenomenon? Well, as it turns out, war is a recent development in our human history. It's not really a long-standing practice. Homo sapiens, as we've learned, they've been around for around 200,000 years. But the archaeological record indicates that war, at least as we understand it today, it only emerged some 10,000 years ago, right around the advent of agriculture. Now, it would be an oversimplification to state that our foraging past was an era of peace and cooperation, but to some degree, that's some useful hyperbole. Let me explain. As we've learned in previous lectures, prior to our transition to agriculture, we fed ourselves by foraging and hunting. And this hunter-gatherer way of life, it shaped our social worlds. Specifically, it kept our communities small, and it leveled out inequality. We know that hunter-gatherer communities were much smaller than the farming-based societies that emerged within the past 10,000 years. Archaeologists and others, they note that bands of foragers typically maxed out at around 100 to 150 people. And in a society where everyone knows each other, if there's a slacker in our midst, we'll know it. You can't slide by in the shadows of a band of foragers. Furthermore, like a college student always on the move between dorm, home, and summer jobs, foragers, they were nomadic. They were always on the run. You see, they followed the food on seasonal migrations. And as non-sedentary people, they couldn't afford to invest in personal property or surplus. In a way, they had to restrict their earthly possessions and food stores to what they could carry. Compared with our overstuffed pantries today, foragers, they didn't have a place to store a few cans of soup for that rainy day. When they wanted soup, they had to start from scratch. So the survival of these small groups required a level of cooperation that made conflict counterproductive for all parties. Now, that's not to say that hunter-gatherers were peaceniks who never fought. But we are saying that these fights, or forager conflict, it rarely erupted into all-out war. Because non-sedentary people, they just can't afford to accumulate property the way we Westerners do today. They cultivated more communal lifestyles. In fact, we can observe this lifestyle even in contemporary hunter-gatherer societies. For example, anthropologist Marjorie Shostak, she lived among the San people of the Kalahari, and she recorded the life of a remarkable woman named Nisa. Now, when she recounts Nisa's childhood, she describes the emotional dimensions of growing up in this kind of sharing economy. I mean, she remembers, for example, how excited and proud she was when her father returned after a successful hunt. But knowing that that bounty would be shared with the whole community, she said it always stung just a little bit. You know, it's like any kid learning how to effectively socialize. Niece's community taught her that feeding all bellies takes precedence over individual accumulation or surplus. And without that surplus or troves of private property, the incentive for war, well, it isn't eliminated, but it is greatly reduced. However, the agricultural revolution changed all of that. Sedentary living and agricultural surplus, it sparked the inevitable rise of urban centers and empires. And that's where the archaeological record shows us a sharp increase in large-scale organized violence or war. The 20th century alone, according to Eric Hobsbawm, was the most murderous in recorded history. He reminds us warfare took the lives of some 187 million people in the 20th century alone. I mean, at first, 20th century warfare was essentially limited to interstate conflict and civil wars. But now, in the 21st century, armed conflict, it's no longer in the exclusive hands of governments and states. In fact, 21st century warfare permeates our civilian lives. And that's a major change. You see, at the turn of the 20th century, only 5% of combat casualties, on average, were civilian. By the end of World War II, however, we see the tide has turned. Around 2/3 of World War II casualties were civilian deaths. And believe it or not, that figure has only risen. Today, well, it's around 90%. That is to say, 90% of those who die in 21st century war, they're civilians. Ultimately, warfare as we know it today is a truly modern phenomenon. And the pervasive armed conflict we see in our lives, it's fundamentally different from previous wars. So, war is a rather recent phenomenon when we consider the long arc of Homo sapiens history. So let's turn to our second myth, the idea that we are biologically predisposed to violence. Now, famous scholars like Hobbes and Darwin, they're not alone in thinking that we humans are hardwired towards aggression and violence. In fact, many researchers have traced this tendency to our primate cousins. Primatologist Richard Wrangham, for example, he studies what he calls coalition killing among non-human species. And he finds that other animals, like chimpanzees, they do participate in coalition killings. Now, these killings involve bands of chimps collectively carrying out violent attacks on rival groups, which sounds a lot like warfare, doesn't it? Wrangham explains that coalition killings are an expression of dominance. But is that the full story? Are we programmed for conflict? Well, in some ways, it appears so. Yet, there might be other biological factors at work that show us that we're not predestined for violence and war. In his book, Demonic Males, Wrangham shows that chimpanzees, like some humans, beat, rape, and kill other chimpanzees. We've even observed them drinking the blood of their victims. But let's not take this predilection of our chimpanzee cousins as an inevitable dimension of our own biological being. Why? Well, Wrangham reminds us to look at bonobo apes too. And he shows us that chimpanzees and bonobos have much different lives despite their shared genetics. Unlike the violence we see in chimpanzees and gorillas, bonobos are the free-loving hippies of the ape family. Bonobo males, they do occasionally become aggressive and violent, but they rarely kill or rape. Why is that? Well, Wrangham explains that tight-knit bands of female bonobos, they actually gang up on and attack male counterparts who act up. Ultimately, Wrangham, he prescribes a little bonobo living as a remedy for our 21st century conflict. You see, he argues that if humans emulated bonobos in terms of increasing the political power and voice of women, our species can suppress excess male aggression. Now, another primatologist, Frans de Waal, he's found that among chimpanzees, attraction between opponents actually increases after a fight. Apparently make-up sex isn't necessarily a human invention. And our propensity for conflict resolution, now that may be every bit as powerful as any inclination to fight. Anthropologist Carolyn Nordstrom, she documented this phenomenon amongst humans in her Civil War ethnography, Mozambique, A Different Kind of War. And in her timely study, Nordstrom looked deeper into unfathomable violence and aggression of 15 years of war. She connects us with soldiers, with wartime profiteers, and even ordinary people. And remarkably, she revealed the unrelenting and pervasive propensity for cooperation amongst ordinary people in the face of extraordinary violence. And in an astonishing refusal to accept a life of war and violence, it's ordinary people who created ways to actively socialize combatants back into a life of nonviolence. They actually established a network of healers, and they even resorted to kidnapping soldiers. They kidnapped and reconditioned them towards nonviolence. So it's apparent that there are some biological mechanisms at work in the history of human warfare. But we've also discovered that biologically and culturally, we're equally, or perhaps more inclined towards making peace, not war. And now for our third and final war myth, the idea that war is universal. Even in an era where gun violence impacts our daily lives, we have brothers and sisters on our family tree who make peace seem as inevitable as war. Take the Amish, for example. I grew up in Ohio, not far from a thriving Amish community, and the Amish, they refuse to fight in wars. They don't even take disputes to court unless all internal efforts to resolve a conflict have failed. One of the core Amish beliefs is the doctrine of non-resistance. So as Christians, they walk the walk when it comes to the Sermon on the Mount. They turn the other cheek. Similarly, in India, we find the Jain religion, which sees the path to peace as our ultimate purpose. In the words of Lord Mahavira, one weapon will always be stronger than the other, but the path of ahimsa, or peace, it remains unsurpassed. Ascetic Jain monks, they even go to the extreme of sweeping a path as they walk, just to avoid stepping on small, unsuspecting insects. You see, all Jains, they practice peace by fostering goodwill towards others, based on the unity and the sanctity of all life. Now, this worldview, it's endured since the 6th century BCE. And like the Amish, Jains may live in a world of armed conflict, but they don't participate. Now, a final group from Southern Africa can get us an even closer look at a human society that makes peace, not war. This is the San of the Kalahari region. They are super sharers. Now, they're one of the oldest indigenous populations on Earth, tracing back their cultural history some 20,000 years. Now, with only a few dozen remaining villages, most of this hunter-gatherer population has transitioned into sedentary farming lifestyles. But nonetheless, their peaceful foraging legacy, it remains. The San, they're known as peaceful people who discourage fighting and aggression, and even competition. Anthropologists, they explain the peaceful lives of the San in part by looking at the lives of their children. You see, in this cooperative, transient lifestyle, there are fewer children around, and these kids, they don't really see much aggression as they're growing up. Typically, San bands only have around a dozen plus children of all ages at any given time. And with such a small crew, competitive games and team sports, they're just less feasible than cooperative activities. So, remarkably, the San have no living memory of fighting over territory, no living memory of war. Richard Lee, he studied the San for over 3 years, and in all, he recorded only 58 actual arguments, of which 34 became physical fights. Put another way, in 3 years, this tight-knit crew sees a physical fight less than once a month and a single argument only about once every 3 weeks. And that's not per person, that's the whole community. So, if we look to our past, and even to groups like the Amish and the San, we learned that war itself is A, a relatively recent phenomenon, B, not biologically inevitable, and C, it isn't universal. If anything, we've seen that humans are wired for conflict resolution, not just coalition killing. Even non-human primates demonstrate their inclination towards reconciliation. So for this final segment of our lecture, let's take a closer look at this idea of humans as peacemakers. Let's see some cross-cultural examples of conflict resolution strategies to see how people transcend violence and aggression elsewhere in the world. Once a thriving global empire, today the Republic of Mali suffers from extreme poverty and a terribly complex security crisis that will probably take decades to repair. Nonetheless, I want to bring you back to Mali, not to discuss the ongoing conflict there, but because thousands and thousands of rural Malian villages, they show us two terrific daily practices that, again, foster peace over conflict. First, joking cousins. In Mali, my name is Solo Sangare. Solo is the name of my adoptive Malian father, and Sangre, that's our shared family name. And every time I go to our neighboring village for the weekly market day, my tea and sugar guy, Chemogo Dumbia, he always greets me with a lively insult, and it's usually something about flatulence. And you know what? He's insulted if I don't engage in a short round of exchanging barbs. I'm kind of known there for slinging insults about eating donkey meat, but I think you'd probably have to be there to find any of this humorous. You see, it's not that we hate each other. In fact, that's the exact opposite of what's really going on here. We're terrific friends. But he's a Dumbia, traditionally a blacksmith's name. And me, I'm a Sangre. We're herders. And we Sangres and Dumbias, we've long been joking cousins. These two families, we've exchanged friendly insults and laughs for generations. But God help you if you try to join in without being a Sangre or Dumbia. You see, every family name in Mali has a joking cousin alliance. And anthropologists, they interpret this cultural phenomenon as a safety valve that prevents enduring conflict. And more broadly, there's another safety valve that promotes unity over conflict. And this is one of my favorite parts of daily life in the village. It's the village meeting. See, Malians, they do meetings that can include very heated exchanges, but when it comes time for an actual meeting, there's a protocol that diminishes the chance that things will get really out of hand. In fact, the meeting protocol itself is an act of consensus building. Now, these meetings, they always start slow. As the elders, they walk to the chief's hut. Everyone brings a goatskin mat to sit on in a loose oval pattern, and with all parties facing each other. Now, when I did my first village meeting to ask permission to live and study with this community, this is how it went down. The elders, they were seated, surrounded by all these onlookers who often chime in when appropriate. Then, my host brother Brahma, he addressed the chief and elders explaining that I'd like to speak to them. And even though every one of us heard that message, the junior-most elder thanked Brahma, and then, right in front of us, he proceeded to repeat exactly what Brahma had said, but he said it to the next elder in order of age. Now, some elders add a couple lines, some even take a few away. But by the time the last elder gives this redundant message directly to the chief, everyone has had their opportunity to add their voice to the discussion. And if you're into quick meetings, stay the heck away from the village, because now the chief will initiate the message chain again, explaining that I may continue with my actual question. And once that message is passed down out loud through each elder, the final elder, right, the youngest one, gives that message back to my brother Brahma, who in turn gives it to me. But remember, I heard that message each and every time, all the way from the chief to Brahma and then back. Now, this process continued, and up and down the line, we settled our business. Now, when I asked the chief later about the meeting protocol, he explained that it allows everyone to be heard, and that it brings everyone together in the spirit of compromise, or, in moments of conflict, reconciliation. Now, leaving Mali, let's stay in West Africa and head to Liberia, where we'll meet the Capelli people. and a conflict resolution practice that they call the Capelli Moot, or in local language, Bere mu menesa. Now, the Capelli, they're hardworking rural rice and peanut farmers, and their small, close-knit communities have a great method for resolving conflict. Now, unlike the US justice system that deploys court hearings to mete out justice through punishment like fines or jail time, the Capelli, they're more interested in reconciliation rather than retribution-style justice. When an offense threatens the social harmony within a Capelli village, the entire community comes together to hold a moot. Now, the moot forum, it takes place in someone's home rather than a courthouse. You see, the complainant who calls for the moot, they'll select a family member to serve as a mediator. But really, there's no singular judge or jury. In the moot, everyone chimes in. The conflicting parties, they directly question and challenge each other, and the mediator and audience, they join in. And by the end of this long discussion, the person deemed at fault publicly apologizes and presents a small gift or two to the aggrieved, who, in turn, offers a smaller gift to help repair that relationship. Then, the guilty party picks up the tab and provides enough rum or beer so that everyone can, well, share a drink. Now, similar mediation rituals, they're found elsewhere in Africa, and anthropologists, they attribute this form of reconciliatory justice as unique for small-scale societies. You see, in a small rural cooperative community, people simply can't afford enduring conflict. It undermines the social harmony required to make a living off the land. So, rather than developing a justice system that locks up people who are desperately needed for fetching water or farming rice, the Capelli Moot, it vets justice while maintaining the social network that ensures the village's bellies remain full. So, let's keep with our cross-cultural case studies of conflict resolution, but for our last example, we'll head to Afghanistan to see how the US military has used anthropology to better understand the socio-cultural dimensions of Afghan communities. Now, anthropology in the military, it's not a new thing, but not everybody really agrees that it's a good idea. You see, back in the 1960s, the US government, they launched Project Camelot, based at American University. Now, Project Camelot was a counterinsurgency study led by anthropologists and other social and behavioral scientists. And the big idea was to better predict and perhaps influence social movements in other countries. The logic was that US national security was threatened by insurgencies all throughout the world, and particularly in neighboring Latin America. So, the orchestrators of Project Camelot, they brought in some anthropology, because insurgencies, they signaled a breakdown of social order. And the military, they wanted to better understand the social and cultural processes that lead to these transformative events. Shortly after the true purpose and funding source was discovered by collaborating Latin American scholars, the military shut down this program, but evidence shows that similar work, it continued nevertheless. Prominent anthropologists like Margaret Mead and Marshall Solins were so affronted by this military co-opting of anthropology, particularly in Latin America and in Southeast Asia, that they helped pass a stern resolution by the American Anthropological Association. Simply put, they made it clear that anthropologists should not participate in what they labeled clandestine intelligence work. And that's why in 2007, the American Anthropological Association once again spoke up about the militarization of anthropology. Specifically, they were reacting to a new military project operating in Afghanistan. It was called the Human Terrain System. The 2007 statement, it was clear that this HTS violated the American Anthropology Association's Code of Ethics, which mandates that we do no harm to our research subjects. Now, one thing that especially raised ethical concerns was that, unlike previous militarized applications of anthropology, the human terrain teams, they put anthropologists in actual war zone combat units. They could carry weapons alongside other, more conventionally trained soldiers. The goal, however, was for the anthropologists to help soldiers and local populations communicate and understand each other. One example would be the Yurga. Now, the Yurga, a community's council of elders, well, that was a setting in which community members, they built consensus with guidance and discussion of Muslim values and teachings. And anthropologists, they helped the U.S. military recognize the importance of these civic conversations. And they brought combat units and communities together, winning friends through understanding and collaborative social projects like building schools, or maybe helping elders deal with problems ranging from food security to fears of being attacked. And the short of it is that the primary rationale for deploying human terrain teams in both Iraq and Afghani war zones was to curtail casualties by winning the hearts and minds of local communities. And to an extent, they did. But the program, it quickly faltered after critiques of mismanagement and dubious behavior compounded with a serious challenge by professional anthropologists across the nation. In reaction to the Human Terrain System program, the American Anthropological Association, they made it clear. Now, they weren't averse to the idea of reducing casualties, but they were genuinely concerned by the fact that anthropologists working in combat units clearly violated our disciplinary code of ethics. Specifically, critics questioned the voluntary subject's ability to decline participation in the team's anthropology work. After all, if a guy with a gun came to my door and asked if I'd agree to join him for an interview, I'm thinking that gun, it's going to work better than a pretty please. And I'd say yes, even if it was against my wishes. Maybe deep down I'm worried that anti-US forces will see me talking with these soldiers, and when they leave, my family could be killed or tortured. I mean, similarly, if any of the information war zone anthropologists produce is used by the military for the purpose of designing combat campaigns and identifying potential targets, then the participating anthropologists, they're in clear violation of our code of ethics. Their work, it directly alters the winds of war, and this can undermine the work of all anthropologists abroad. I mean, the last thing a field researcher needs is to be accused of being a meddling intelligence officer. At its peak, the HTS, it employed some 500 people who served in 30 teams deployed in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and at a cost of over $725 million. But once the majority of U.S. troops were pulled out of these theaters, the HTS program was officially closed in 2014. But it's likely that we'll see new forms of anthropology in combat zones and elsewhere in the military because, despite the controversy, the generic idea of a military with cultural knowledge of the people they engage with, it's become essential. And I gotta tell you, I found that over time, more and more of my students side with the HTS concept, arguing that the potential to save lives makes the compromise worthwhile. Others, however, they do challenge this position in the spirit of our anthropological code of ethics. Regardless, it's always a thoughtful and important discussion. So with that, let's wrap up our anthropological exploration of conflict and reconciliation. Deep in our bones, we typically interpret as scary and threatening that which is unfamiliar and unrecognizable. And those feelings, they can quickly escalate into a maelstrom of violent behavior and, of course, even war. But through biology, language, and culture, anthropologists help us render the unfamiliar familiar, or, as Ruth Benedict once said, to make the world safe for human differences. Today, we saw how humankind has a wealth of cultural and even biological resources that we can use to transform conflict into reconciliation and harmony. And in a conflict-ridden world where 90% of wartime deaths are civilian casualties, we'd do well to build on what we've learned about the anthropology of war in order to develop an anthropology of conflict resolution, too. Let's spread the word. As we began to see in our last lecture, anthropology is not just an intellectual exercise that satisfies our curiosity about human cultures past and present. It's also a discipline that can give us practical insight into some of the biggest challenges we face as our planet's 21st century caretakers. Today, we're going to continue that theme by looking at the fascinating topics of forensic and legal anthropology. Now, what can anthropology contribute to criminal justice and the legal system? Well, when you hear news stories about the tragic discovery of human remains, for example, they always include a pretty good description of the deceased, right? They may even have an actual name, but how do they do that? You see, there's people behind the scenes who work that all out, and a lot of them are anthropologists. And of course they are, right? We've seen how biological anthropologists, they retrieve and identify hominin bones from millions of years ago. So why not do the same exact thing with more recent bones? We'll get to legal anthropology soon, but let's start with forensics. Linguistically, the origins of forensics is forensis, which we translate as of or before the forum. Now, the forum was where Roman citizens once presented criminal cases in public. True, modern Romans have swapped the forum for courtrooms, yet modern forensics, in a tip of the hat to ancient Roman justice, it's still about good evidence and a well-built case. Now, when it comes to anthropology, forensic anthropologists essentially analyze and identify unknown human remains, among other things. And they do so for legal, criminal justice, and now for humanitarian purposes. Remarkably, by studying skeletal remains, forensic anthropologists determine a victim's age, sex, ancestry, health, and a lot more. And perhaps more importantly, they determine identity and cause of death, two critical pieces of information in legal, criminal, and humanitarian contexts. So, how about a hypothetical discovery? Let's walk through the basic process that a forensic anthropologist would go through to determine a victim's biological profile and cause of death. Even if all we have are barely recognizable human remains, forensic anthropologists can still work out the mystery. Okay, imagine we're living in New Mexico. We're teaching forensics and biological anthropology there. And since we started this teaching gig, we've been on the call list at the coroner's office. You see, she regularly calls us in to help figure out what's going on when someone discovers unidentified human remains. And today, while at school, we got the call. You see, it turns out a construction crew out on the Turquoise Trail over there in Cerrillos, they just unearthed a rather grim discovery, an assortment of what appears to be human bones. And you know what? When we get there, we discover that we have a good piece of a skull, most of a pelvis, and a few hand and arm fragments. And so be it. That's all we need. I mean, more would be great, but this will do. So with the bones in hand, it's off to the lab, and let's work this mystery out. Now, once we've recovered the perceived victim's remains, we inventory what we have as we lay them out on a table in their respective anatomical positions. Specifically, we determine that, indeed, these are human bones. So next, we work out whether we have one or more individuals here. And if there are multiple people, we have to figure out how many there are. For our hypothetical remains, the bone ratios, which is the number and types of bones we find, well, they're pointing pretty clearly in the direction of just one individual. Really, there's zero indication here that we have any commingled remains. That said, if you wanted to double check, we could always bring in some DNA analysis, but again, things look good. This is almost certainly one person. Now, let's figure out whether we have a male or a female. Let's work out the biological profile. And we're fortunate to have a nearly complete pelvis because it's that pelvis that's the best indicator for biological sex. Why is that? Well, When forensic anthropologists look at the pelvis, they can see certain characteristics that distinguish a male from a female. Let's look at 3. First, there's the general shape of the human pelvic brim. Now, that's that hollowed out ring inside of the pelvis. If the pelvic brim is heart-shaped, we've got a male, while a more circular pelvis, that's going to indicate it could be a female. Similarly, we can look at the sacrum. Now, the sacrum is the tip of the tailbone at the rear of the pelvis. Now, here, a forensic anthropologist would look to see if it points more inward or outward. Now, if the sacrum is pointing inward, again, we're looking at a male. But what if the remains were so badly destroyed that we didn't have the sacrum? What if we just had a front fragment of the pelvis? Well, we can also look at the pubic angle or arch. This is the outside angle created by the bottom front of the pelvis. Now, if the pubic arch is less than 90 degrees wide, say in the 50 to 80 degree range, that's a classic sign that indicates a male. And arches greater than 90 degrees are indicative of a female pelvis. And we can figure out what's going on with these differences if we consider their implications on birthing a child. The wider, more rounded female pelvis has evolved to facilitate childbirth. Now, putting all of this together for our hypothetical discovery on the Turquoise Trail, let's say we examine the remains and we discern a heart-shaped pelvis with an inward-pointing sacrum and a pubic arch under 90 degrees. What's our conclusion? Of course, we're looking at a male. But get this, we can usually work out biological sex simply by examining the skull. Now, just like the pelvis, there's sexual dimorphism in human skulls. Check it out. Again, we can look at 3 areas to work this out. First, the chin. With our male skull, we'll see a square-shaped chin, while a female skull, well, they'll have more of a rounded, almost pointed chin. Or there's the back of the jaw. Now, here on the male, we'll see more of a 90-degree angle versus the female's wider angle. And last, another great skull feature that helps us discern biological sex of human remains, that's the orbital margin, or our eye sockets. And if we look up here to the top edge of the socket, we see the supraorbital margin, or edge. In females, this edge is sharper, while in males we see more rounded upper edges with a larger brow ridge and even a more sloped forehead. Then, by comparing our specimen with established comparative measures, most of the time we can accurately determine biological sex. So, returning to our hypothetical victim, let's say that we examine the skull and find that the chin, jaw, and orbital margins all confirm what we concluded from the pelvis. There's no doubt we have a male here. But how old is this guy? What was his age at death? Here again, the skull can help us. You see, when we're born, we've got these sutures or seams on our skull. And without them, childbirth simply wouldn't work. The sutures join the bones of the skull, and as we age, they begin to fuse. And right at the top, going straight down the middle, we have the sagittal suture. Now, this is a great way to read the age of our victim because for all of us, our sagittal suture, it fuses between the ages of 29 to 35. I mean, sure, there's mild variation here, but we can use this technique with great certainty. So if we look at our hypothetical skull and we see his sagittal suture is about half fused, then we can conclude that this guy was probably in his early 30s. Information like age and sex, that helps develop a biological profile for unidentified remains. But one last analysis we need to do is to work out how long it's been since our 30-something male victim met his end. How long has this guy been dead? Well, we have a great way to do this, but it's not for the light-stomached. Simply put, we use insects. Actually, it's more like we read the insects. You see, some insects, they arrive right away and get at that corpse. You know, insects like blowflies or maggots, they can be present for a few days or even up to a year or more. Now, blowflies, amazingly, when we see where they are in their development cycle, that can help us get an accurate date of death down to the day, or at least really, really close to that. So for our hypothetical human remains, those early insects, they're long gone. These bones are at least a couple years old, and maybe even a little older. We're going to have to send them out for some further testing. So it's clear. Forensic anthropology has a comprehensive protocol and toolkit to work out the details we need to assemble a profile for unidentified human remains. And in our hypothetical lab, we got a great start with just a few quick procedures. We definitely have a male. He's in his early 30s, and he died at least a couple years ago. It wasn't a recent death. And as we need to work out more, we can collaborate with other forensic specialists who bring new tools for our forensic toolkit. Now, there's forensic archaeology, DNA analysis, chemical dating techniques. There's even dental, pollen, geological, and isotope analysis. I mean, isotope analysis, it's a fascinating technique that can help us determine a lot of things. It can even be used to reconstruct the diet of prehistoric peoples. Like many professional anthropologists, forensic anthropologists work in a wide variety of occupations and settings. As you can imagine, many forensic anthropologists work as professors and academic researchers. But actually, most of them work outside of academia in government agencies, the armed forces, medical examiners' offices, and so many more places. One increasingly important and necessary application of forensic anthropology puts these men and women to work in non-governmental organizations and war crimes tribunals. The United Nations, they report that into the 21st century, we can expect increased instability arising from human conflict and natural disasters. And we're going to need forensic anthropologists to help work us through this. For example, following the catastrophic loss of life in tragedies like the 9/11 terrorist attacks, forensic anthropology has taken on a new humanitarian dimension. Because the skills and methods we've already talked about, forensic anthropologists, they have increasingly been called on when it comes time for identifying victims in mass casualty events. We can also see the growing importance of forensic anthropology through the lens of the US Congress. In the 1990s, two important pieces of federal legislation were passed, and they both demonstrate the broad social role that forensic anthropologists are now playing outside of the academy. The first of these two legislative acts is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, otherwise known as NAGPRA. Now, passed in 1990, NAGPRA, it requires that the remains of any Native Americans once discovered must be turned over to the appropriate contemporary Native American nation. And this protection, it covers grave sites and artifacts, not just human remains. Then, in 1996, the Aviation Disaster Family Assistance Act was signed into law. Now, this act basically formalized a federal infrastructure aimed at specifically dealing with the aftermath of mass casualties. Now, this infrastructure supports and dispatches DMORT teams, well, otherwise known as Disaster Mortuary Operational Response Teams. These teams include forensic anthropologists and a whole host of other experts. There's funeral directors, medical examiners, pathologists, medical records experts, fingerprint specialists, forensic dentists, X-ray technicians, the list goes on. But for logistical purposes, the US is divided into 10 regions, each of which has a dedicated DMORT team that's ready for deployment anytime there's a possibility of mass casualties. And once human remains are actually recovered, the DMORT team, well, their process begins in earnest. And actually, it's a two-part system, and it's all brought together with a remarkable computer program called VIP, the Victim Identification Profile. This program can integrate nearly 1,000 different data types. On the one end of the system, families and others, they help the team collect and input all kinds of ante-mortem or pre-death data. That can be things like photographs, X-rays, DNA, dental records, whatever they can get. Then, on the other side of things, the forensic experts, they recover the physical remains. And as they inventory and analyze these remains, they enter that post-mortem data into the VIP program. Now, following a string of airline accidents, the first DMORT team was launched in the 1990s, and from the beginning, the role of forensic anthropology was central. And more importantly, it was integrated into the DMORT system, explicitly for identifying remains in humanitarian service to the deceased and their families. Okay, let's take a quick pause here. We've just learned that forensic anthropologists contribute their knowledge of human biology to 1, assist in criminal and legal processes, and 2, more recently, they've become critical responders after natural disasters and human catastrophes. And before that, we took a peek to see how forensic anthropologists actually create profiles of victims by analyzing their remains. So now, let's go deeper. Let's dig in. Let's see some real forensic anthropology in action. I want to look at 2 snapshots of forensic anthropologists who I think are nothing short of superheroes. First, the Bone Lady. And I'm not talking about that Cleveland Browns superfan with dog bones in her hair. No, I'm talking about Mary Manheim, a gifted storyteller and an honored member of the prestigious American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Now, Manheim, she is the archetype of the forensic anthropologist. In her career, she handled over 1,000 forensic cases and was called upon by law enforcement agencies from all over the United States. Notably, she was a critical force in establishing the Louisiana Repository for Unidentified and Missing Persons Information Program. This program, it brings closure to case after case of unidentified and missing persons in Louisiana. In fact, the program helped find and reconnect half of the thousands of missing people cases resulting from regional hurricanes since Katrina. And hearing that, I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that Mary Manheim has been an active DMORT team member for years. And her notable cases have ranged from Hurricane Katrina to serial killers. And actually, come to think of it, maybe you've seen her work on television. For a while, she did some clay facial reconstructions of unidentified persons for the Fox TV show Missing. And you know what? If her work still doesn't ring a bell, I know you've heard of one of her toughest career cases, the recovery of 7 astronauts following the Space Shuttle Columbia's disaster in 2003. As part of her regional DMORT team, Manheim was called up once it was clear that the Columbia had exploded over Hemphill, Texas. Oddly enough, her father's hometown, Hemphill leaped to the occasion as Manheim remembers thousands of people helping the cause. There were advance teams all across the region, and when they identified human bones or other remains, Manheim and others, they rushed to the scene. Now, the riveting account of this surreal experience, it's one of my favorite chapters of her book, The Trail of Bones. So that's one anthropology giant, a forensic anthropology giant. Let's now go to Guatemala, where I want you to meet another major figure in this field, Jillian Fowler. Now, starting off as a secondary geography teacher, Fowler took up forensic anthropology after hearing the horrific stories told by Guatemalan refugees in Mexico. The refugees had fled a civil war that claimed some 200,000 lives. And Fowler, she just happened to be teaching English in Mexico when these stories compelled her to get a degree in forensic archaeology and eventually head to Guatemala. And it was there that she spent 6 years exhuming mass graves. And a quick read from her published field journals, it provides a powerful dose of the grimness and the inevitable emotional toll of this important work. Fowler writes, "I pick up a skull and begin to gently rub away some of the dirt. This young man was executed with a single gunshot to the back of the head, a common form of execution in this area strewn with clandestine graves. I begin to lift the rib cage, where I find signs of another impact wound. He was shot twice from behind. Now, a quick check of the rest of the skeleton gives me an idea of his age at death, less than 21. And next to him lies the skeleton of his father. What must their last thoughts have been before the bullet struck? She continues, I glance up. The woman beside me is peering into the grave, watching my every move with a look not of despair or fear, but of strength and courage. She's their wife and mother, the only member of her family to survive the horrors that were inflicted upon so many some 25 years ago. The moment Fowler arrived in Guatemala, she found her calling. She was determined to help families find loved ones who were taken away and never seen again. Their experience had gone on and on for well over 2 decades. This is loss without closure. But Fowler's efforts helped change that. And the healing nature of this work was evident in her lab, where victims' families, they actually visited their skeletal remains. Fowler's account, it mentions family members laying flowers, lighting candles, praying, and of course, crying. And the gist of it is this, that putting to rest a loved one that was taken through a horrific tragedy like the Guatemalan Civil War, it doesn't bring the people we miss back, but it does bring them home, right? The candles and flowers in Fowler's lab are clear signs that the power of forensic anthropology extends well beyond legal and criminal cases. Forensic anthropology has a critical, deeply effective humanitarian purpose as well. But it's important to note that the work of Fowler and other like-minded researchers does much more than help with closure following atrocities like a civil war. The data that they produce has been used in criminal courts to successfully prosecute